Today, I'm welcoming to the program Barbara Freese, who's an environmental attorney, energy analyst, and author of the recently released book, Industrial Strength Denial: 8 Stories of Corporations Defending the Indefensible from the Slave Trade to Climate Change. Barbara, it's great to have you on today.
Thanks for having me, David.
So this is a theme, this idea of denial. It's a strategy, really. And whenever there is a disagreement in culture, in politics, wherever, sometimes the facts are debated, but sometimes you see a strategy of simply denying the facts, saying those are not the facts, or I don't believe what you are presenting me. Sort of an equivalent to burying one's head in the sand, as it may be. How far back does the sort of grift of denial go as you've charted and researched it?
Well, I went back as far as the slave trade
Yes.
and a challenge to it in Britain in the late 1700s and early 1800s. I do think of this as a part of human psychology, so I think it goes back as long as we've been humans. But as far as a documented industry campaign of denial, we know that it's at least as old as the slave trade.
And what were the arguments made around the slave trade?
They were appalling and absurd. They basically embraced this kind of rescue narrative that they were not, enslaving people. They weren't taking captives from Africa and putting them on horrible plantations. On the contrary, they were rescuing them from a worse fate in Africa, where they would have been put to death as prisoners of war or eaten by cannibals, and delivering them to, first of all, on a lovely festive slave ship to a very comfortable plantation where they would be well treated and have comfortable homes and be taken care of in old age and sickness. And it was really appalling. And because this was the British trade and the British dominated the trade, they were speaking to an audience that had no direct experience at all of slavery. So they could really get away with some whoppers that they couldn't have gotten away with in the United States, where people at least saw something of slavery.
I've even heard in the last few years that typically from folks from certain political persuasions in the United States, I'm not for slavery, but conditions for some freed slaves were worse than with certain slave owners, which seems sort of like a similar idea.
Well, and in fact, that was a strategy that the British slave traders used. They frequently compared the conditions that slaves lived under with the poor in Britain. And of course, the poor in Britain did live under terrible conditions. So it was sort of an example of sort of this downward ratchet that as long as there were bad conditions for one group, you could use that as an excuse to allow even worse conditions for another group.
Very present right now when we talk about denial is climate science and climate science denial. And you write about this in the book. I've been covering it for a very long time. Is there something unique to climate science denial, maybe either from a psychological perspective or in some way that distinguishes it from the other denial grifts that you've covered? Or is it just another version of the same sort of thing?
Well, pretty much all the climate denials that we see have appeared in other industries over the decades and centuries. But there are some things about climate denial that I think make it just particularly easy. One of them is that it is such a huge problem. It is such a long-term problem. It is something that everybody contributes to at least a little bit in terms of consuming fossil fuels. And that's such a familiar thing that our minds are not really triggered to be afraid of things that are that familiar. And another thing I think that makes this unusual is just the phenomenal success of climate denial. I mean, you never heard presidents of the United States, at least in the modern era, denying that tobacco caused cancer. But you have heard at least one of them calling climate change a hoax.
Yeah, that's interesting because some of the same people, one of the phenomena that I find interesting about the climate issue is we know what the science is and we know it's overwhelming. And at this point, it's like almost a cliche to repeat it time and time again. But the people that deny it seem to accept uncritically the claims of some small sliver of scientists they can find, or in other words, they seem to not apply the same critiques to those that happen to share their pre-existing notion. And I've not found a good way to break through that kind of epistemological barrier when I talk to those people.
Right. One of the things I write about in the book is basically tribalism and its effect on the mind and how easily triggered it is, and then how incredibly powerful it is. So in times of uncertainty, in times of conflict, it becomes particularly strong, and certainly the level of skepticism you would apply to people outside your tribe becomes very, very high, and the level of skepticism you apply to those within your tribe telling you what you want to hear is very, very low. It's also a sort of exaggerated confirmation bias that we all indulge in personally, but that gets amplified in times like this when the issue is this big and when the industry in question is really, one of the most, or maybe the most powerful industry in the world, and where you're talking about harms that are really inherent in its central product. In that sense, it's kind of like tobacco. And, interestingly, the big oil companies now, just like big tobacco, don't deny anymore the fundamental facts of their product causing harm. And yet they have been denying it for so many decades and put in place so many barriers to regulation that they're still benefiting from the decades of denial past.
What seems to be effective in getting through the denial? I mean, I'm thinking of, with coronavirus as an example, initially when there were some cases in China, it was very easy to just say it won't come here. And then it did. And it's very easy to say there won't be a lot of cases and they'll go away. And then there's lots of cases, but you say, well, we're not going to have a lot of deaths. And then there's deaths. And then people will say, listen, I'm hearing that people are dying, but I'm not seeing the bodies. And then you see the news video of the mass graves being dug and the refrigerated trucks. And people say that's optics produced to trick people for political reasons. Like there's always that ability to say it's stage managed, it's fake, whatever. What is effective at getting past all of that?
I wish I could give you a formula that made it clear what's effective. It does seem to matter to have facts and to have imagery and to bring that before the public. What tends to be most effective in overcoming denial is for there to no longer be any real credible benefit to denial. So, for example, that's, I think, what brought the tobacco industry finally into, the modern era, because it was to the point where nobody believed them anyway, and they were being sued for fraud, and they had all kinds of other problems. And they realized that admitting that their product killed people wasn't really going to prevent them from selling it, even after decades of saying if this was true, we'd stop selling it. So that tends to be what happens. I'd like to imagine that eventually, when it comes to larger efforts to overcome denial, if you think of us as being very tribal and taking on kind of a herd mentality, then perhaps when people who are at the head of the herd switch, it might lead to some greater acceptance. You might look at the George Floyd protests, which isn't really the same thing, but you had the video of his killing.
Right.
And I think that helped a lot of members of the public who had no financial or ideological stake in this one way or another, but except that they wanted to believe the world was, better than it is. When they saw that, I think a certain amount of public denial about just how bad things could be went away. So I do tend to be a big believer in evidence and trying to bring that out there, even though we do have a lot of examples of it failing to convince people.
How much of a problem do you see the corporate media coverage of some of these issues being? And the example I'm thinking of is, although the science on climate is, 99.98 to 0.02 or however lopsided it is you want to claim it is, it's somewhere in that range. You have numerous and regular corporate media debates where you have two people and they're given equal time, and one person, 50% of the debate, represents the 99.98, and 50% of the debate, meaning one person, represents the 0.02. It's this sort of false balance problem, which I think corporate media engages in order to be neutral, as they say, but neutral is not objective. And so I'm wondering how much you think that contributes to some of this denial and provides cover.
Yeah, I think that has always been a problem when it comes to particularly climate change. I mean, even if you were to try to do it in some more balanced way, and for example, you were to have a debate with 99 climate scientists who recognized the threat and one who denied it, I think that the audience would still come away saying, oh, well, then there are two different opinions.
Mm.
So I think you're right that pretty much any attention to what is now a very much discredited viewpoint gives it more credibility with the public, and particularly with the public that is not scientific and not fully aware of all the data, because you can never really convey all the data or the strength of it to a non-scientific public.
When it comes to something like coal, which relates to the climate debate more generally, in that certainly, if you disbelieve the science on climate, you might be more supportive of coal because of its immediate sort of monetary benefits in that it's cheap and we don't need new infrastructure like we would with solar or wind or whatever the case may be. How have you seen or sort of observed the coal debate happen during the current administration, where we've seen the president essentially say that he wants to take this out of the market, the free market, of course, pointing to letting coal die to revitalize an industry that from a climate perspective doesn't make sense. Where does this fit into the discussion in terms of people who say, yeah, we really should bring coal back? Is it a denial of the climate science? Is it a sort of political or tribal-based reaction, some combination of the two?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a combination of the two, and it's certainly a reflection of the fact that to the extent the coal industry has been defending itself in the past by saying that you should let the market decide,
Right.
That sort of ideological justification for burning coal really wasn't what was ever motivating them. And in fact, what the president has tried to do is to get power companies to buy coal and subsidize coal, even when they would prefer not to. So that was a pretty clear illustration that the ideological justification was never really what was driving it.
The last thing I want to touch on is, I think if we didn't mention this, we would be missing a huge piece of this, which is the denial side is often very well funded. And when you think back to tobacco, and I forget if it was the Clean Skies or Clean Air Initiative or whatever, which was basically about convincing restaurant owners, hey, if you want freedom from regulation, we need you on board so that people will be allowed to smoke inside your restaurants when the movement for no smoking in restaurants started. These are really well-funded movements, and that seems to dramatically skew a lot of the conversations that are happening, does it not?
Oh, sure. I mean, the industries that I wrote about, and I focused just on 8 industries, and most of them really big ones, they had enormous amounts of money to promote their viewpoint, to give to other sort of free market ideological groups to promote their views more secretly, to hire people to write articles, but not to explain where they got the money. And then ultimately you end up with an entire industry that supports other industries that are trying to deny the science. So you've got the law firms, the PR firms, the advertising agencies, and the so-called nonprofits that become advocates to oppose regulation. So, I mean, I try to write about this partly from a kind of psychological perspective, looking at the social science. And I think what happens is that for the individuals in the corporations that confront these charges, that there is a very natural, instinctive inclination to deny it, which is just part of human nature. I think it then moves pretty quickly into a corporate strategy, and then it moves from there into its own kind of a denial industry with the same PR firms and others appearing again and again. And then I think it moves into an ideology. And so it's that progression that makes denial this very human thing, but promoted by these very powerful institutions, such a destructive thing.
Do you have any insights into the psychology of the cogs in the wheel, so to speak, that are carrying out a lot of these denial campaigns? Because I could imagine a situation where the people working at the PR firm or the people working at a corporation or the law firm at the individual level, many of them probably know that what they're doing is lying and that they're denying what are the facts. Is it as simple as, listen, I'm a cog in the wheel, I'm just trying to put food on the table, and this is going to happen regardless? Or have you had any insights into that at the individual level?
I think that is definitely part of it. And corporations themselves, especially the big ones,
Yeah.
certainly the big ones, are designed to make the individual not feel responsible for what the corporation does. It does that through division of labor. You're just a cog in a wheel, and we know for sure that diminishes your feelings of responsibility for the consequences. You've got management divided from ownership. You've got this ideology that tells managers that their only responsibility is to maximize shareholder profit. Meanwhile, shareholders don't feel responsible because they're far away. It's transactional. They may just own the stock for a little while and they don't know what's going on anyway. We also know that power tends to focus the mind on your most salient goals, which if you're a corporate executive is profit. It also, there's some evidence, seems to reduce your risk awareness and your risk perception once you become aware of it, and your general social responsibility. Again, there's the tribalism, the competitiveness inherent in corporations, the market mindset. So yeah, there are a lot of psychological things that you could point to. In fact, I suggest in the book that if you are a supervillain trying to get the world to destroy itself by taking crazy risks, you might just create a society very much like our corporate-dominated market society, because there are many, many things there that undermine our innate sense of social responsibility.
Very well said. The book is Industrial Strength Denial: 8 Stories of Corporations Defending the Indefensible from the Slave Trade to Climate Change. We've been speaking with the book's author, Barbara Freese. Barbara, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it.